Marrowgate Library never closed its doors in 80 years, yet the basement has been sealed for 2 decades. A hum grew from faint vibration to physical pressure, recorded by no machine, acknowledged by no official. The previous librarian entered the basement on the final night and never returned upstairs. The building remained open while hiding a permanent closure beneath the floorboards. What is the real reason no one is allowed downstairs? Step into the shadows with us as we uncover a legacy long forgotten. Some secrets are better left buried. Or are they? Subscribe to see what we unearth next. Leon Thorne arrived to assume the lead librarian position at Marrowgate, inheriting a legacy of continuous operation. For 80 years, the lights had never dimmed, the doors never locked, a monument to unbroken service. Yet in the reference room stood a door sealed with iron bolts from the outside, the paint undisturbed for 20 years. The library board had been briefed during the hiring process. They spoke of the institution's importance to the city's identity, of the need for a steady hand to maintain the collection, and of the unique requirement that the building never be vacated. They did not speak of the door. They did not speak of why the previous keeper, a man named Arthur, had vanished during a standard inventory check. The hum was the first thing Leon noticed. It wasn't a sound exactly, but a vibration in the floorboards, a pressure behind the eyes, the taste of copper in the morning air. It was as if the walls were watching. When he first stepped across the threshold, the air felt dense, as if the oxygen were being crowded out by something heavier and older. He spent his first week cataloguing the rare manuscripts, but his eyes kept drifting toward the iron-bolted door. It sat in the corner for 80 years, a silent witness to a truth no one dared to speak. The staff avoided the area entirely. They shelved books with a hurried efficiency, never lingering near the back of the reference room, where the floorboards seemed to thrum with a rhythmic, low-frequency intensity. The predecessor's apartment above the library remained untouched. The bed was unmade, the tea kettle cold, belongings arranged as if their owner had simply stepped out and forgotten to return. Leon found a half-written letter on the dining table, addressed to no one, discussing the weight of the shelves and the appetite of the foundation. The library board had offered Leon a cryptic warning about maintaining the seal and respecting the architecture's deeper foundations. They emphasized that his role was one of preservation, not exploration. But history has a way of breathing through the cracks. Leon felt less like a librarian and more like a jailer, tasked with guarding a prisoner he couldn't see. One evening, while moving a heavy oak wardrobe in the apartment to reach a flickering lamp, Leon discovered something that the board had missed. Taped to the underside of the bottom drawer was a key. It was heavy and blackened with age, as if it had been forged in a fire that burned hotter than any earthly flame. The metal felt unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room. It bore no markings, no maker's stamp, only a slight taper that suggested a lock of immense complexity. The object held a weight that didn't belong to this century. Therefore, he began searching for what the key might open, suspecting the official story was incomplete. He started with the obvious targets. He tried the key on the iron-bolted door in the reference room, but the lock there was a standard industrial deadbolt, far too modern for the ancient metal in his hand. He tried the cabinets in the rare books room, the gates of the loading dock, and even the heavy safe in the administrative office. Nothing fit. The key remained a silent question. As the days passed, the hum grew more pronounced. It was no longer a background nuisance. It was a physical presence that moved with him through the stacks. To understand the present ruin, we must look at the shadows of the past. Leon spent his nights in the archives, looking for mentions of the basement's construction. Most people walk past the gate, never noticing the one detail that hides a century of silence. He found no record of the basement ever being sealed for repairs, despite the board's claims of structural instability. There was only the silence of the records and the growing vibration beneath his feet. What does the key unlock, and why did the predecessor never return to use it? Leon intended to find out. The journal was hidden behind a loose wooden panel in the predecessor's desk, its leather cover swollen with moisture that shouldn't exist in the dry apartment above the library. The wood had warped slightly around the secret compartment, suggesting years of seasonal expansion and contraction that had nearly revealed the hiding place on their own. Leon pried it free with careful fingers, sensing the weight of 20 years pressed between its pages. The handwriting began with precision and ended with trembling, uneven lines, as if the hands that held the pen had aged decades in the span of mere months. The paper itself felt wrong beneath his fingertips, thick and fibrous, with a texture that suggested trees grown in soil not found on any map of this region, pulp pressed in mills that had not yet been built. The entries documented something the city engineers refused to acknowledge. The hum intensified when specific books left the shelves, volumes on theoretical physics, unwritten histories, and technologies not yet invented. The predecessor had tracked the correlation with scientific patience, noting how the vibration in the floorboards peaked when certain minds encountered certain texts. It was as if the library were consuming the information, digesting it through some process that turned knowledge into physical pressure. The journal mentioned titles that didn't exist in the card catalogue, books that patrons described reading but could never locate again, their descriptions matching volumes dated decades hence, including one on quantum entanglement published in 2047, and another on the history of a war that hadn't occurred. But history has a way of breathing through the cracks. The official reports declared the foundation sound, the structure intact, and no seismic activity detected. Yet Leon had felt the hum himself, that pressure behind the eyes, the metallic taste of copper that lingered in the reference room like blood on the tongue. The predecessor's journal confirmed what the city denied, that the building was processing something vast and invisible, something that registered on no instrument but weighed heavily on the living. The discrepancy between measured silence and felt vibration suggested a frequency that existed outside the range of human hearing, yet resonated in bone and blood, a sound felt rather than heard. The final entry was written in a hand so strained it barely resembled the careful script of the earlier pages. "The basement is not below us," it read. "It is beside us. The key opens what should not be opened." The ink had pooled in certain letters, as if the pen had hesitated or the hand had shaken with the weight of what was being recorded. Certain words were smudged where tears or sweat had fallen, blurring the distinction between ink and emotion, between record and confession. The page bore water stains that looked like fingerprints, as if the writer had touched the paper with hands wet from something other than water. Leon held the key in his palm, feeling its unnatural heat. It was the only object missing from the official inventory of the predecessor's effects, the only item that suggested the man had intended to return somewhere, to unlock something that required a metal forged in fires that didn't exist in the world above. The journal offered no map, no diagram, only the correlation between books and hum, between knowledge and pressure. The key seemed to vibrate in sympathy with the floorboards, as if it recognized the frequency of the hum and longed to complete a circuit that had been broken 20 years ago, a connection between lock and listener that had been waiting for a new hand to turn it and seal the breach. To understand the present ruin, we must look at the shadows of the past. The predecessor had spent 20 years listening to the building, tracking its digestion of the future, waiting for someone to inherit the burden he could no longer carry alone. The key was an invitation, or perhaps a trap. The hum continued its steady vibration in the floorboards beneath Leon's feet, a reminder that the library was still hungry, still processing, still waiting for the lock to turn. The building had selected him, drawn him here with the promise of order and silence, only to reveal that the position required not curation, but sacrifice, not management, but martyrdom. What does the key unlock, and why did the predecessor never return to use it? Leon watched the dust motes dance in a shaft of dying light, knowing that his tenure had truly begun. The key was cold in Leon's palm, heavier than its size suggested, as if forged from metal that remembered the weight of stars. He had spent 3 days walking the library's corridors, testing it against every lock, every hasp, and every forgotten cabinet. None had turned. The key remained an unanswered question, a silence in the shape of metal. He felt the eyes of the portraits in the hallway following him, their painted gazes heavy with the knowledge of what he carried. The air in the stack seemed to thicken whenever he drew the key from his pocket, the very atmosphere reacting to its presence. The city archives occupied a limestone building 3 blocks east, its vaults holding the architectural history of streets that had been rebuilt so many times the original paths existed only in ink. Leon requested the original blueprints for Marrowgate Library, filed under the construction permits of 1943. The clerk retrieved a tube bound in cotton tape, the paper inside brittle with age. It smelled of vinegar and old dust, a scent that Leon had come to associate with the uncovering of things meant to stay hidden. He carried the tube back to the library, his pulse quickening with every step. Leon unrolled the plans across a reading table beneath a skylight that cast the room in grey afternoon light. The drawings showed the foundation as he expected. Footings, load-bearing walls, and the reference room marked clearly with its dimensions. But where the basement should have appeared, the plans showed only earth. Soil layers, bedrock, and the natural substrate of the hill upon which the library stood were all that existed below the floor. There was no excavation indicated, no stairwell, and no subterranean chamber. The basement had never been built. Yet, he had stood before the sealed door himself. He had felt the hum through the floorboards, the vibration that suggested vast space below. The discrepancy between the plans and the physical reality created a vertigo of logic, as if the building had grown a limb that existed outside its own anatomy. He returned to the library at dusk, the blueprints rolled under his arm like evidence of a crime against physics. In the reference room, he knelt upon the floorboards, pressing his palm flat against the oak. The hum was there, constant, a frequency that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. But when he moved his hand 12 inches to the left, near the window, the quality changed. The vibration felt different, not softer, but organized, as if the wood were responding to a specific key in a chord. It was a rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat slowed to a crawl. Leon marked the spot with a pencil. The boards there were original, matching the 1943 construction, yet they sat slightly higher than their neighbors, as if something beneath had pushed them upward. He pressed the blackened key against the gap between 2 boards. The metal grew warm, then hot, and the hum shifted from a vibration to a tone that he felt in his teeth. He realized then that the lock wasn't behind a door. It was the floor itself. The key wasn't meant for a keyhole, but for a seam in reality. He would wait for the peak hum, the 3 a.m. moment when the vibration became audible as a physical presence. The key had found its lock. The floorboards would open. Leon sat in the darkness of the reference room, the blueprints scattered like fallen leaves around him. He thought of the predecessor, Arthur, and whether he had sat in this same spot, feeling the same heat in his palm. The building felt alive around him, the shelves groaning under the weight of books that shouldn't exist. He was no longer just a librarian. He was a witness to a breach in the world. As the clock chimed the 3rd hour, The air began to shimmer. Leon gripped the key, his knuckles white, and prepared to descend into a space that the blueprints insisted did not exist. The silence broke. The books on the shelves bore publication dates that hadn't arrived yet. Leon pulled one free and read the spine. The Collapse of Western Infrastructure, 2089. The pages inside described events that wouldn't occur for decades, written in a hand that hadn't been born. Other volumes carried dates from centuries hence, technologies not yet conceived, histories of nations that didn't exist, wars that hadn't been fought. But the shelves held stranger things still. Some books were dated in the past, decades or centuries gone, describing events that had never happened, treaties never signed, and plagues that had been erased from the timeline before they could spread. These were the unwritten histories, the futures that had been digested and discarded, the possibilities that had been processed and rejected. He realized that the library above was merely the skin of a much larger organism, a biological machine that fed on the potential of what might be. Leon understood then that this was not a storage space, but a processing point. The corridor was a throat, the shelves were teeth, and the books were being digested, broken down into their component possibilities, absorbed or expelled according to rules he couldn't yet comprehend. The library above was consuming information from the future, drawing it down through some mechanism of stone and wood and weight, filtering it through this impossible space before allowing it to manifest in the world above. It was a temporal refinery. Where there should have been a dusty cellar, there was a monolithic engine of causality. The air felt thick with the residue of 1,000 lives that would never be lived because they had been deemed incompatible with the current stream. Every step Leon took felt like treading on the ghosts of 100 different tomorrows. At the corridor's end stood a desk. It was monolithic, constructed of material that didn't match the limestone and oak of the library above. It seemed to have grown from the floor itself, a mineral formation rather than a piece of furniture, its surface polished by years of use into a sheen that reflected the lantern light with colours that didn't belong to the spectrum Leon knew. Behind it sat a figure. The provenance of the desk was ancient, its texture like obsidian, but warm to the touch. It sat in the absolute centre of the vibration, the point where the hum became a solid wall of pressure. The predecessor was there, seated in a chair that seemed to have moulded to his form over decades. But it had been only hours above, Leon realised. 20 years in the sealed basement, but mere hours in the world outside. The man's skin had become like parchment, thin and translucent, showing the blue map of veins beneath like ink on a page. His eyes were dark as old ink, pools of black that seemed to absorb the lantern light rather than reflect it. His breath came shallow and slow, each exhalation carrying the scent of dust and centuries. He looked less like a man and more like a vestige of a person, a relic preserved in the stagnant air of the archive. The revelation came not in words, but in weight. The predecessor gestured to the shelves, to the books from futures not yet arrived, and Leon understood. The library was digesting time itself. The hum was the sound of temporal pages turning, the weight of unwritten history pressing against the present, demanding entry. The corridor was a breach, a wound in the fabric of sequence, and the predecessor had been holding it closed with the only seal that worked, the rapid expenditure of a human life. He had aged decades in hours, burning his years like fuel to keep the future from flooding into the present, to buy time for the city above, while the library processed what it could digest and rejected what it could not. The question remained unspoken, but hung in the air like the dust motes dancing in the lantern light. The predecessor's ink-dark eyes fixed on Leon, and in their depths was the weight of the desk, the chair, the burden that had consumed one life and now demanded another. Could Leon turn and climb the impossible stairs, return to the world above and pretend he had seen nothing? Or was he already bound to the desk, chosen for his solitude, his capacity to disappear, his willingness to bear the weight of futures not yet written? He realized too late that the key hadn't just opened a door, it had locked him inside. Leon took a step toward the desk, and the air around him curdled. It wasn't just the physical density of the atmosphere anymore, it was the psychic gravity of a million discarded choices. Every book on the surrounding shelves represented a path the world hadn't taken, a version of reality that had been chewed up and spat out by the library's unseen digestive tract. He could feel the pressure of these ghosts against his skin, a cold, prickling sensation that felt like needles made of ice. The predecessor's hand remained extended, a skeletal invitation that promised nothing but the slow, agonizing evaporation of Leon's own future. He looked back toward the spiral stairs, but they were shrouded in a mist that smelled of ozone and wet stone. The way back was a fading memory. The predecessor's lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the words blossomed directly inside Leon's mind, tasting of old copper and bitter herbs. He spoke of the Great Sieve, the name given to this subterranean anomaly by those who had built the library as a mask. The building wasn't just a monument to knowledge, it was a containment vessel for a leak in the universe. Somewhere beneath the bedrock of Marrowgate, time had begun to pool and stagnate, creating a pressure that threatened to burst through and overwrite the present with a chaotic flood of conflicting tomorrows. The Guardian's role was to sit at the focal point of that pressure and act as a human grounding wire. Leon realized that his entire life had been a series of subtractions leading to this specific moment. His lack of a family, his nomadic career, his preference for the company of paper over people. It wasn't a personality, it was a resume. The library board hadn't looked for a scholar, they had looked for a void. They needed someone who could disappear without causing a ripple in the world above. Someone whose absence would be as quiet as a book being returned to the wrong shelf. The weight of this realization was heavier than the stone ceiling above him. He was being asked to become a ghost while his heart was still beating. He reached out and touched the surface of the desk. The material was neither stone nor metal, but something that felt like frozen light. The moment his fingertips made contact, the hum changed frequency. It surged upward, a violent crescendo that vibrated through his marrow until he feared his bones would shatter. He saw flashes of the city above, not as it was, but as it could be. He saw Marrowgate submerged under a glass sea, then a version where the streets were paved with bone, then another where the sun never rose. These were the futures the library was currently processing, the raw data of time that he would have to filter. The predecessor's eyes began to dim, the ink-like blackness receding to reveal a terrifyingly pale grey. The man was fading, his purpose finally fulfilled by Leon's presence. The transfer of the burden was a physical sensation, a literal pouring of one man's exhaustion into another's potential. Leon felt his own pulse slow down, matching the rhythmic throb of the floorboards. His vision sharpened, allowing him to see the subtle threads of light that connected the books to the desk, the lines of causality that he would now have to manage. Everything changed when the predecessor finally spoke aloud, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the desk. He told Leon that the library didn't just protect the city from the future, it protected the future from the city. Human greed and ambition were the primary pollutants in the temporal stream. By filtering the possibilities, the Guardian ensured that the world above remained stable, predictable, and safe. But the cost was absolute. To save the world, Leon had to leave it. He looked at the heavy, blackened key sitting on the obsidian surface. It was no longer a tool for opening doors. It was the anchor that would keep him tethered to this desk until his own skin turned to parchment, and his own eyes filled with ink. The weight was his now. Leon sat in the chair. The wood, or what resembled wood, seemed to yield and mould against his form, not with the give of a cushion, but with the memory of something that had waited decades to remember a human shape. The predecessor watched with eyes like ink, the parchment skin of his face showing no expression that Leon could read. The transfer required more than presence. It required understanding. The predecessor spoke, his voice like paper rustling in a draft from a window that had been sealed for years. He explained that the Guardian did not stop the future. The future was a river that could not be dammed, only channeled. The desk was a filter, the chair a valve, and the human seated there a regulator who determined which futures could enter the present and which must be held back, digested slowly, or rejected entirely. The hum was the sound of temporal pages turning, the pressure of unwritten history pressing against the membrane of now. Leon learned to read the hum. It was not hearing but sensation, a vibration that spoke in frequencies felt in the bone. A high, tight pressure meant the future was pushing hard, demanding entry. A low, rolling wave suggested timelines shifting, possibilities rearranging themselves. The predecessor placed Leon's hands on the desk's surface, and the material seemed to pulse beneath his palms, alive with the residue of decades of filtration. The lesson ended when the predecessor's breath caught, his chest hitched, a mechanism failing, and Leon saw that the man had no more time to give. The predecessor had been holding the breach closed for 20 years above, which meant decades or centuries below, burning his life at both ends to keep the city safe. He looked at Leon with those ink-dark eyes, and in them was not fear, but relief. The burden would continue. The line would hold. The predecessor crumbled. It was not death as Leon understood it, but consumption. The man's form collapsed into dust, into the residue of years spent too fast, leaving only the clothes that had contained him and a fine powder that coated the desk like ash. The key remained, blackened and heavy, now Leon's to hold. The dust settled, and the hum shifted from a scream to a murmur, the breach holding steady as the new guardian took his post. Leon felt the weight immediately. It was not the gravity of the earth, but the gravity of tomorrow, pressing down on his shoulders, settling into his bones. The hum became part of his heartbeat, his breath, a lullaby of pages turning in a library that had no end. The corridor stabilized. The books on the shelves stopped their frantic rearrangement. The future, for now, was held at bay, filtered through the guardian at the desk. Leon looked at his own hands, already feeling the subtle thinning of the skin, the way the light seemed to penetrate further into his flesh than it had only minutes ago. He was no longer a man who lived in days and hours. He was a component of the library, a biological anchor for a building that existed in the throat of time. Above him, the patrons would still be browsing the stacks, unaware that their very reality was being curated by a ghost in the basement. He reached out and touched a volume on the edge of the desk, the history of a drought that would now never happen. As his fingers brushed the spine, the book dissolved into grey mist, its potential absorbed by the desk and neutralized. This was his work now. He would sit in this silence, watching the shadows of what might be, and ensuring they never became what is. The library above remained open, its lights a beacon of normalcy in a city that didn't know it was drowning in a sea of possible endings. Leon closed his eyes and listened to the hum, a steady, rhythmic pulse that told him the world was still turning, exactly as it should. He was the secret foundation, the silent watcher, the man who stayed behind so everyone else could move forward. The weight was absolute, but for the first time in his life, Leon Thorne knew exactly where he belonged. He was home. Leon worked with materials that had no names in the catalogues above. The The floorboards that had yielded to the key now required sealing from the other side, a permanent closure that could only be enacted from within the impossible space. He found iron in the corridor that had not been forged in any century he recognized, heavy bars that seemed to grow from the walls themselves, crystalline and dense. He positioned them across the opening, bolting them into stone that drank the metal like thirsty soil, creating a barrier that would read as solid bedrock to any probe from above. The work took time measured in breaths rather than hours. Each bar he placed added weight to the seal, not just physical, but temporal. The floorboards above would read as solid to any engineer's tap, but the true seal was the guardian himself, the life force that regulated the flow. Leon left the decoy door above sealed as well. The iron bolts remained in place, the paint undisturbed. The city engineers would find what they expected when they came to inspect: a basement secured against intrusion, an anomaly contained by conventional means that required no further investigation. The city engineers would find what they expected: a basement secured against intrusion, an anomaly contained by conventional means. They would declare the structure sound, the foundation stable, the hum a trick of acoustics and old plumbing. They would never know that the true library extended downward into spaces their instruments could not measure, or that a man sat at a desk below, holding back the weight of tomorrow. They would file their reports and leave, satisfied that the danger had passed. The paperwork would show the library inspected and declared safe. The board would accept these findings with the solemn nods of those who had always known the truth, but maintained the fiction for the safety of the city above. The official narrative would be a shield, a layer of bureaucratic paper protecting the impossible reality from the curiosity of the mundane world. Above, the library continued its operations as if nothing had changed in the depths below. The board hired a new librarian to manage the circulation desk, to shelve the returns, to maintain the 80-year tradition of doors that never locked and lights that never dimmed. This new keeper of the upper rooms knew nothing of the guardian below, nothing of the sealed floorboards, nothing of the key that had once turned in a lock that wasn't there. The patrons came and went, checking out their books, reading in the quiet rooms, occasionally feeling a vague unease they could not name, a pressure behind the eyes, the taste of copper in the air. They attributed the unease to old pipes or imagination, never knowing their lives depended on the guardian below. The daily rhythm of stamps and whispers masked the cosmic machinery grinding beneath the floor. The hum continued. It was a warning now, rather than a breach, a lullaby sung by the pages of the future, a reminder that someone below was holding the line. The secret remained preserved, the weight remained held, the legacy of the unbroken library remained intact. The city above moved through its days unaware, protected by a sacrifice it would never witness, guarded by a silence that had no end. The library stood as it had for 80 years, never closed, never fully open, a monument to the cost of keeping tomorrow at bay. The doors remained unlocked, the lights stayed lit. Leon, now part of the very architecture he once curated, watched the threads of time weave through his fingers. He was the anchor in the storm of potential, the silent clerk of the unwritten. Every soul walking the streets of Marrowgate owed their linear existence to the man in the lightless room, yet his name would vanish from every record above. He was the final volume in a collection that no one would ever be allowed to read. He sat, he listened, and he held the world still. Years passed, though the word held little meaning in the corridor where time moved differently. Above, the seasons turned in their proper order. Leaves fell, snow gathered, and spring returned with its green insistence. But below, decades accumulated in the span of months. Leon felt the weight of those years settling into his bones, not as an ache, but as density, as if the future pressing down on him was slowly compressing his substance into something more permanent, more archival. The air in the basement had become his natural element, a thick soup of potential and residue that he inhaled without thought. He no longer required the lantern. His eyes had adjusted to the low-frequency glow of the books themselves, a shimmering luminescence that pulsed in time with the great sieve. His skin had taken on the quality of parchment, thin and fibrous, showing the blue traces of veins like watermarks in ancient paper. His eyes darkened to the color of old ink, pools of black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, as if they were filling with the residue of all the futures he had witnessed. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that every gesture cost him time, that every unnecessary motion accelerated the consumption of his remaining years. He had become a living artifact, a witness to the provenance of a world that didn't know it was being watched. The physical world above felt increasingly thin and translucent, a mere shadow of the heavy, complex reality he managed from his seat at the obsidian desk. The books on the shelves had changed. The volumes he had first encountered, histories of wars not yet fought, technologies not yet conceived, had shifted their positions, some vanishing entirely, while others appeared in their places with bindings that smelled of fresh ink and futures newly written. The library was not a static repository, but a living digestive system, processing potential, absorbing what could be and expelling what could not. The timelines shifted and settled like sediment in a deep pool, the water clearing only to cloud again as new possibilities poured in from the breach. Leon watched these shifts with a detached, scholarly interest. He saw the rise and fall of empires that would never exist, the invention of machines that would never be built, and the lives of billions that would never be born. Leon came to understand that he was not a prisoner, but a curator. The desk was not a cell, but a filtering mechanism, and his presence, the rapid aging, the consumption of his years, was the cost of regulating the flow. He organized the unwritten, catalogued what hadn't happened, and sorted the possible from the probable. The library digested time itself, and he was the enzyme that facilitated the reaction, the catalyst that allowed the building to process tomorrow without choking on its own appetite. He felt a strange pride in the work. It was a service of the highest order, a maintenance of the very fabric of existence that required no recognition and offered no reward beyond the stability of the world he had left behind. He accepted the role completely. The weight became familiar, not comfortable but known, a pressure he could breathe against, move within, and shape with his will. The hum, which had been a scream when he first descended, had settled into a murmur, a lullaby of pages turning in the dark, the sound of the future writing itself into being. He sat at the desk, his parchment skin absorbing the residue of ink and time, his dark eyes reading futures that hadn't been born, and he held the line. The library above remained open, the doors never locked, the lights never dimmed, the 80-year legacy of continuous operation maintained by a new librarian who knew nothing of the guardian below. Leon listened to the future turn its pages, the hum a lullaby of tomorrow, the weight of what comes next pressing down on his shoulders like a blessing and a burden. He was the curator of the unwritten, the guardian of the desk, the keeper of the breach, and the library, above and below, never closed. The Marrowgate Library still stands, its doors open, its basement sealed, the hum continuing its vigil in the bones of those who know how to listen. Some archives demand curators who never leave, preservationists who pay with their years to keep the future from overwhelming the present. Leon remains there, the silent heart of a city that sleeps in peace. Subscribe to Fabled Legacies for more hidden histories. We unearth what remains buried.